know me, I'm Mark Hopton, and I'm the executive director here. Yay. And we are. This is our third night of our celebration of Women's Her Story Month. Very thrilled to be presenting these wonderful plays. Many, many, many thanks to the committee who put together the whole Women's Her Story Month program. It's awesome, and their work has been stellar. The minute last year's was over, they were working again to set up this year's, and it shows. So, a couple of things to know. There will be an intermission, and the first play is presented as a stage reading. The second play is off book, and the second play takes place about 15 years later than the first play. And I just want to thank Ann Smith for her commitment to the theater and for directing this wonderful production, and to Adair for the writing, and to our cast. It takes a village. This art happens because we are a community, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. So, with no further ado, please enjoy the show.
Turn off your cell phone.
Yes. Yes.
When the first flight landed in Liverpool, 5 waggons upon the street. 1 money last I spent it fast, but drunk as drunk could be. But before me money was all up on liquor and the horse, I made up my mind that I was inclined to go to sea no more. No more, no more, to go to sea no more.
I made up my mind that I was inclined to go to sea no more. Ah, the sea shanty. Sailors' work songs and sentiments of their voyages. This hall of seafaring times, and so familiar. Mother would be surprised to see this here. Her private journal on display. Yes, I gave it to the Maritime Society before I moved away, but the Newburyport Custom House was my father's realm, where Captain Stephen Bray declared his cargo and filled out the ledgers for the Volant. You could have seen the Volant. A 65-foot merchant ship my father saw built and then captained halfway around the world. In the 1850s, Newburyport's packet ships were the fastest sailing vessels anywhere. It was no place for womenfolk, and yet my mother was on board 2 such journeys, and wrote about it here. I could almost smell the sea in the binding. Touch is so familiar, the slant of her pen strokes. It was good to have a testament of Mom's time on the Volant. But none of us read it. Not when we lived on Water Street, nor the 25 years I kept a home on Spring Street. My brothers Stephen and George were also seafaring men, but they had no interest in our mother's account. Is it not the same way now? Who cares to examine the text of a parent's travels? The words seem as stern and gray as the photographs from those times. But look a little more closely. I was not yet 5 years of age when the Volant was being ready to sail from Newburyport. It was September 1854, and the church steeples and ship's masts stood out against the bluest sky. The wharf went practically to the middle of the Merrimack, with bridges to the ship. My brothers had to stay in school, but Mother brought me to sea. For 2 whole years we were gone, and I remember everything.
Husband, have I not followed the progress of the Volant from your first share in its building? I know its flanks and decks and holds, as I know the rooms of our home. And did not your friend, Captain Graves, commend having his wife aboard, that it favorably moderates the disposition of the crew, I shall be an asset to you in ports of call, currying goodwill with the merchants' wives and your fellow officers. Let this maiden voyage of your good ship be my fondest wish at last come true. And he agreed. Captain Bray and I have an easy way about us. We were married when we were both past the age of youthful impulse, and we have been blessed these 12 years with robust children and a continuing rapport. But I have held fast to my dream of going to sea ever since I was a child, and my father's ship did not return.
First, we had to take the train to New Bedford, and then a steamboat across the Sound to meet the Volant in New York. It was very noisy and smelled like many strong things together. We stayed in the United States Hotel, and Mama took me shopping.
New York is filthy, frustrating, and altogether charmless. I hope our stay here is short. Captain Bray has us bound for New Orleans for cotton that we'll deliver to Liverpool, and then on to Havre, France. I saw Captain George Lunt in the parlor of the hotel.
Once we moved aboard the ship, it was like our own private town, moving across the water. Mama showed me the hole in the wall, where we can see the waves up close. I can count the ship's bells to know the watch, and I can sing most all of the fiddler's songs, even the ones I'm not supposed to. Cook lets me help him count the hens and livestock, and sometimes when I'm on deck, the crew salutes me. It's the best thing in the world to be on a ship.
The motion of this boat was not as I expected. We cast off in fair weather, but then the waves grew quarrelsome. Fanny adapted so well to this new world, and she consoled me through my discomfort. For days I was confined below deck and barely got any work done at home.
Mother was different at sea. She laughed more, but was never idle. We did much sewing and clothwork.
Miss Fan wanted to learn to stitch sailcloth, and the crew would let her try. She took to reading very early and couldn't wait to learn French for our stay in Havre.
I had turned 6 by the time we reached France. Hardly a word about me for months, until we visited a school where I would go while they decided on the next part of the trip. She thought I'd cry at being left where none of the children spoke English, but I loved it.
How fortunate we've been over the last 10 months. I have seen the Florida Keys and islands in unimaginably blue waters, watched as our sailors caught and cooked the fish that ran along the sides of our ship, weathered a gale on the ocean that split our mast. Oh, and typhoid in New Orleans that took one of our brethren, Captain Coffin. I shan't forget his widow's face, bearing so much sorrow that I have been somehow spared. As we made our crossing that summer, we encountered the Mary H. Voss, and Miss Fanny cried out,
That is my nation's flag! Later, a French boat came alongside, needing food and supplies, which Father directed sent over right away. For days, we kept sight of them, our 2 tricolored flags waving at each other.
The mood was hopeful between our countries. The French were coming from the Crimean War, and there were fireworks for Napoleon III's birthday. Your father once took us in a carriage through the French countryside, and we saw a fort being built by Russian prisoners. Hundreds of them. Oh, such handsome men in long coats with red bands and flat blue caps, mostly fair-haired. And even their mustaches were trimmed.
We were supposed to be back in Newburyport by then, but instead it was back to sea.
1855, more than a year away from my sons and family. Oh, how I missed my sons. now bound for India with sparse news of loved ones and little known of what to expect.
It did not go well in India. The first mate and some of the crew went to jail. There was a mutiny.
Oh, Fanny, I told you never to say that word. There were complications you were too young to understand. We came into port in the dead of night, and the natives fairly swarmed aboard the moment we docked. Captain Bray had difficulty establishing order out of the chaos, and there was a work stoppage.
They came aboard to sell us food and sign on to work. But our crewmen wouldn't associate with the Indians. They called them coolies and heathen because they were barely clothed.
How wise of you to perceive that at the age of 7. Perhaps the captain should have asked for your counsel. Oh, do you remember how we didn't set foot on shore for over a month? How 2/3 of the crew were confined to quarters without rations, while the rest disappeared into town and were arrested? Oh, yet there was no representative of our government in Akia, and yet your father's persistence enabled us to quell the uprising and get the ship back to its purpose. Thank divine providence for the arrival of the Wide Awake and other American vessels during those grim weeks. They brought news, letters, and the fellowship that I believe all mariners share. Oh, my joy could not be contained when we saw the Walter Lord come into port. I immediately arranged that we visit our dear neighbors, Captain Pettingill, who I knew to be traveling with his wife. As our 2 captains conferred on business matters, Hannah Pettingill induced me to go to the Akia Bazaar and make an exploration of our own.
I could have been a sailor. By the time we made the crossing home, I could do lots of seaman's tasks. I could hold myself fast in the November wind, even when the swells were high and the sails were reefed. I never got the fever. But Mother had to stay in bed for 18 days. I sometimes read to her as she quilted. Mama was determined to finish this patchwork made from all the places we'd been.
My discomfort was nothing to the thought of seeing my boys, now 12 and 13. The hope we would all be together by Thanksgiving. The weather had been foul, and even the captain had bouts of fever. One such day, when he was in sickbed, there came great shouts calling him topside to aid a ship in distress. The Dahlia had been bound for England with a load of lumber from Quebec, but it was taking on water and beyond repair. We soon had all 16 of her number aboard the Volant, who were heartily glad to be among us. With a fair wind and double crew, we couldn't have made better time to Boston Harbor.
I was so happy that winter. My brothers teased me and called me sea urchin. I knew they envied me too. We regarded each other like a new family. And Mother didn't seem to mind having a household of her own again.
I'm afraid things were left in quite a muddle in my absence. The sooner I could help settle accounts, the sooner Stephen could get the Volant back to its commerce. To be a captain's wife in this town wasn't as lonely as you might think. Families in Newbury or Ipswich might never leave their farms to go as far as Boston. But we here had a sense of the wider world. Even those who never set foot on a ship might have flowers in their garden from the Orient. We shared ideas with one another far beyond our neighborhood congregation.
After a few years home, you certainly changed your tune.
Husband, I can't endure another moment in this town. The children are grown, and there is nothing to occupy me here. It's time for George to get his sea legs, and I shall be of greater service to you now than I was on your maiden voyage.
And so could I.
Oh, dear Fanny, you're 11 and must attend your studies. Your brothers are both engaged in training for their careers. We are so fortunate that George can apprentice with his father on the Volant, but he'll have to work very hard. When you're older, you'll understand.
It's when my life became ruined.
Good.
It wasn't only by accident that I'd been given a taste of the ocean and the lands beyond. But I was not to be allowed that again. None of the other girls could know what I'd lived or why I'd never be happy staying behind. How could my mother not understand?
How vexing Fanny has become. I do crave a respite from her accusing tone. How came my daughter to dislike me so?
It wasn't only the ocean that I missed. I loved the sounds and the motion of the sea, but it was the rules of the ship that made me feel safe. The officers and crew knew their duties and together made the Volant sail its best. We were like a family on a moving island we had all to ourselves. It was different on land. On shore, you follow land rules that break up your family. My brothers could dream of sailing ships of their own, but I could only dream of becoming a proper young lady. Mother's second voyage was in the spring of 1860, and they were gone for 2 years. The first cargo was lumber from New Brunswick, which was sold to merchants in Great Britain. From there, they negotiated trade with England, France, and India. Our country was preparing for the war between the states. At home, I was at war with my mother for most of the year.
Now we are bound up the coast for New Brunswick and the city of St. John. I am filled with a different eagerness this time, so familiar with this ship and my dear captain. And I pray that Providence lets us keep to our journey as planned. Poor George is not faring well. I suspect his desire to chew tobacco with his crewmates only worsened his biliousness. We are at anchor in Carlton, across from St. John, and I look forward to our planned walk around this outpost. It's an austere-looking place with stony soil and steep hills, yet the homes look new and well-kept. As we turned upriver, the roads were covered with sawdust and wood chips, which helped the traction of the horse-drawn carts. Lumber is stacked as far as the eye can see. We were told that there is a drought and that large tracts of forest have been on fire. When we returned to the wharf, the tide was so low, our ship was listing from the bridge, and I had to hike up my skirts to climb a ladder straight up its side.
Most unbecoming. A 45-year-old woman traipsing through the seaweed, acting like a stevedore in skirts. Oh, the shame my poor brother must have endured.
We took the ferry to St. John, and what a charming city it is, with fountains and broad streets with fine stores. I ventured inside a large cathedral, which seemed a showy building, more for effect than humble worship. Captain Bray says business matters are proceeding exceedingly well, and we will leave for London on the morning tide.
George wrote that for his 16th birthday, he was most awfully seasick and homesick and unsure of this path.
Oh. I treasured that time with your brother. By his next birthday, he would set sail on the Eagle Wing, a broad ship out of San Francisco, an ocean and a country away.
You never talked about that in your letters. And George is hardly mentioned in the journal. But you sent us pages and pages about jolly old London and how Papa's birthday was just one day after the Queen's. Incroyable. J'étais stupéfait.
While the captain was occupied with his investors, I visited a great many chapels and parks and palaces. Oh, George and I toured the Tower of London, where the beef eaters seem to relish detailing the bloody history. In Hyde Park, our carriage rode alongside the nobility. Everyone so well turned out and affable. Our neighbors, the Atwoods, were staying in nearby lodgings, so Mrs. Atwood and I steamed up the Thames, past the Houses of Parliament, and on to Greenwich. Oh, there we saw buildings dating back to 1078. And there was Hampton Court, and the Zoological Gardens, and
It's 1860, almost 100 years since the birth of our country, and my mother has become an Anglophile.
Queen Victoria was not so different in age than I was, but she had been a queen for more than 20 years. She had a fine and handsome husband, and many children, and was respected, even beloved as England's ruler.
I repeat, it was 1860, the year before Prince Albert's death, and before Victorian came to mean perpetual mourning and rigidity and colonialism. Victoria remained queen for most of my life, even when I reached the same age as my mother on this voyage.
When at last the contracts were in place, we were met by a fine steamship crew to make our way out of Liverpool. And Stephen, my eldest, was among the officers. As the Volant departed for New Orleans, I believe Captain Bray and I were blissfully unaware of the troubles that would beset the cotton trade and wreak havoc in the mills of Lancashire.
This was the year before the Union blockade stopped all imports and exports to our Confederate states.
After a month of blue, bone-chilling cold, we arrived during Carnival in New Orleans. During Mardi Gras, young people wear masks and outlandish costumes, and there was music and much merriment late into the evening. Our welcome turned unpleasant, however, when we discovered our chief cook had been abducted off the street and thrown into prison. Captain Bray was only able to liberate him after paying a large sum of money to the authorities. Our loyal steward is a free black, but we learned this treatment is the widespread practice in ports of slaveholding states.
When I was aboard the Volant, Cook would let me count the livestock and help fatten our holiday turkey. That bird was a scheming one. For the day before Thanksgiving, he managed to escape his pen and perch upon the mizzenmast. When the crew tried to gently urge him down, that turkey flew overboard and our dinner was gone.
There were delays on the Mississippi as the two steamers towing us put the ship onto a sandbar, and we listed helpless in the traffic of other vessels. Then, within hailing distance, we recognized the Kenmore, directly out of Newburyport, and captained by Alexander Graves. His wife, Mary Lunt Graves, has gained some renown for her own seamanship. She once brought their boat to safe harbor in the middle of a storm as her captain lay disabled below deck. When we at last reached our mooring, we commissioned the repairs and painting of our ship's cabins, while Captain Bray and I took up lodging in St. Paul's Square. We saw many familiar faces.
Her very best letters were from that spring. I wished you could have come home then. Remember the story about the slave wedding? You even made me a picture of her dress.
Yes, it was at the home of the captain of the steamship for two of his slaves. We were the only spectators besides the Methodist minister and the captain amongst some 30 slaves celebrating the marriage. There was such gaiety, we forgot the strangeness of our presence there. And your father and I did a little dancing. Oh, Fanny, the songs were most stirring.
You brought me lace and French combs from New Orleans like nothing to be found in Massachusetts. But you didn't return for another half a year.
Well, because we were one of many merchant ships bound for India, where our trade would not be adversely affected by the war. 12 weeks at sea to reach Calcutta, 950 miles. It was monotony, but for one terrifying storm, water on the deck, half a leg deep, but even that didn't drown the vermin. I destroyed the 18th rat as we weighed anchor. It was such an annoyance.
India must have been very different that second time, with friends there from the Kenmore and the Continental. No mention of heathens and mutinies this time. Just the beauty of the gardens and the famous banyan trees.
They are a wonder, those trees. Huge and spreading. I received word from George. He was safely back in San Francisco. We languished there in Calcutta. Our business stalled, and no direct news of home. Only the dreadful intelligence in the English papers.
The war was all anyone ever talked about. Newburyport sent its share of men to the Union Army, but in my family the men had always been gone, far away where any fate could befall them.
Captain Bray and I were gravely worried about our country, but it could not diminish our excitement to be headed home. The Volant carried us speedily, as if she too couldn't wait to be again in Boston Harbor. One night, as we neared home, the captain and I shared the first watch on the upper deck, enjoying the moonlight and hush of a dead calm sea. Stephen suddenly leapt up and cried, "There she blows!" We ran to the ship's rails and saw the water rise in a great motion, and right below us, the huge back of a whale. It was a whole company of whales, and they seemed to be dancing around the ship, so magnificent. But we could only glimpse them breaching in and out of the moonlight.
And when me money was all gone on liquor and the horse, I made up me mind that I was inclined. Oh, Mama, you loved it too. I was 5 and you were 45, but we both had the sea in our veins. You know, I became a lifetime member of the Marine Society of Newburyport. I lived until 1935. And even in my 80s, I was known for establishing shipboard libraries on all kinds of vessels. Some memories are like oil-soaked canvas, waterproof. Nothing can make them fade. Those old salts sensed what we knew of their world. They respected us.
Sometimes they would even salute us. We sold the Volant to a British company after the war between the states, and it provided transport for the first Scandinavians to join the Mormons in America. Your father and I are at rest in Oak Hill Cemetery, but I still don't know how my journal is exhibited here.
I bequeathed it to the Marine Society, which was dissolved in 1905, and their artifacts went to the Historical Society of Newbury, Caleb Cushing's old house on High Street. Custom House opened in 1975, but they didn't know what they had from you till 2011. Mama, you've been rediscovered.
Well, I merely chronicled the travels few women had the privilege of making. It's not this journal that is special, but that you honored me by placing it in the hands of history. I was the daughter and wife and mother of seafaring men, but you, sweet child, brought our lives forward. Did you ever forgive me for leaving you behind?
No more, no more, to go to sea no more. I made up my mind that I was inclined to go to sea no more.
Life